No.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to all our viewers. And I would like to start by thanking, obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for giving us the opportunity to do this. And also, I'd like to thank our Ustadh Danyaal for being here back with us again to do part two of strategies to help post lockdown and return to school, but in the context of special educational needs. So I welcome back Ustadh Danyaal, and he will take us through this session and he will talk to us about how children with special needs, whether they're in a school setting or whether they're in a home setting with parents, on how to help them get back into somewhat of a normal routine after this lockdown, which all of us have experienced for the very first time in our lives. So, Ustad Danyaal, over to you, inshallah.
Okay. Jazakumullah khairan. Maulana. Assalamu
Barakallah.
alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all our viewers and listeners. Welcome for returning to the part two of this session. It's really a follow-up of our session that we had a few weeks ago with Ustadha Nabeela and Sister Zainab, the speech and language therapist, where we were talking about sort of strategies post-lockdown. This is part two, where we'll be going into a bit more detail and really thinking about the return to school, which is fast approaching all of us. So, Sheikh, when you're ready for the next slide. So why is preparing for post-lockdown important? So thinking about any change for anybody, change is difficult for all of us. But for someone with SEN autism, it can be particularly difficult. What we saw at the start of lockdown, which was about 4 or 5 months ago now, many families would have struggled to adapt to a new routine. That would have been not going to school for parents, not going to work, being enclosed at home for long amounts of time. And for many kids with SEN, not having the safety net of a routine that they know and comfortable with, for example, going to school 5 days a week, going to the breakfast club first thing in the morning, and then going to madrasa on a Saturday or Sunday. And all of that had been sort of taken away because of COVID. So now we're at the stage thinking about the return to school come September, where there's going to be a new normal and a new routine to contend with. So thinking about those anxieties that we all get on the first day back of school or coming back from a holiday, there's going to be those anxieties on top of the anxieties linked to COVID that everyone else is going to be feeling at this time. So next slide, please, Steph. So where we're at in terms of the lockdown easing right now. So we've really moved from a national response where we had that national lockdown that the whole country was facing to more localized responses to outbreaks in terms of the coronavirus. So we saw Leicester was still under lockdown, whereas other things were open up in parts of the country. And restrictions were reimposed in places such as Blackburn and Leicester a few weeks ago, just before Eid. Now, the idea of the government at the moment is that for all years to return in September, and there's talk of a trade-off. So, for example, in order for schools to fully return, things such as restaurants and pubs or cafes and things like that would have to close so that schools can reopen. And there's the idea of social bubbles being introduced. So the idea is that, for example, in secondary school, you'll have corridors allocated just for certain year groups. So, for example, in the English corridor of a certain school, you'll have year sevens, and in science, you'll have year eights, for example. There's also the talk of year groups being introduced gradually. So on one particular day, year sevens might come in, on another particular day, year 10s or 11s might come in instead. So what does this mean for us and for those families with SEN? We're in a very much of an unprecedented situation for everyone, from teachers, therapists, parents, and children. And there's going to be anxiety across the board for everybody there. And so what will be discussed today will be applicable to both those with SEN and those who don't have SEN as well. It's very important that we communicate this information that we're getting as we're getting it, and the situation is changing daily. So even today, Boris Johnson was talking about the importance of schools being opened, and that it's a big national urgency for schools to be reopened at the moment. So just getting the idea that schools will be opening again and discussing with our children is very, very important at this moment in time. Next slide, please, Chef. So thinking about this lockdown experience, it's a good chance to reflect. So obviously we're in the summer holidays now, and we've just experienced this lockdown of the last 5-6 months or so. And it's a good time to really reflect with our children about how this lockdown experience has been. I was thinking about some of the major life experiences that we've gone through during this lockdown period. So we've experienced Ramadan being in lockdown, we've had 2 Eids as well. Sort of the differences between the Eid in terms of what we normally would experience over Eid compared to life of a lockdown. Any significant life events that have happened, perhaps have been the birth of family members, for example, or maybe sadly the death of certain people, obviously related to coronavirus as well. Thinking about how we can really put these thoughts and feelings down on paper. For certain children, it can be very, very difficult. So one of the things which I like to, especially with secondary age children that I work with, is using brainstorms or mind maps. Now, a mind map is a tool that has pictures on it and color, and it's a good way of really developing their ideas, particularly for those who have children who have difficulties articulating how they're feeling or difficulties getting out their ideas. One of the things which I'm a really, really big fan of is using video to talk about experiences. So creating a vlog or a video diary or a video memoirs to talk about lockdown. So again, it's just having a video in front of you. Everyone has a camera phone these days. So having it on themselves and just being able to talk about what they did, perhaps go by a month-by-month basis, if you like, how April went, etc. Next slide, please, Chef. So here, again, thinking about an example of a strategy that you could use with your child of a mind map. So here's an example of a mind map. You have the main idea in the middle, and you branch out from the central idea. So having color there, you've got pictures here as a visual tool. So a good mind map, if you're ever doing it, would have color or have pictures. And yeah, I'm a big fan of it. I use it a lot with people who are studying for their GCSEs as well. So you could use it across the board, really. Next slide, please, Sheikh. So thinking about transitioning back to school and the feelings that it might entail, you could have a little table here, like we have here. What's the intensity of the feelings that we're experiencing at the moment? So how anxious are we feeling about the virus on a scale of 1 to 10, for example? Are we really anxious? If it's really anxious, it could be a 9 or a 10, for example, and using one word. So, for example, I'm feeling really worried, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling frightened. I mentioned in my previous seminar as well about using color for those who have who are non-verbal. So color coding certain emotions. So red for feeling sad or upset, and for the intensity levels as well. I mentioned zones of regulation, and that could work quite well here too. Next slide, please, Chef. So here again, I've got another strategy using another visual tool. So if anyone has access to widgets or sort of symbol makers, here you can have the symbols laid out in front of your child. And very, very simply, what I liked about lockdown, so it could be you liked being at home and you could color it in green, for example. I liked being able to rest. I liked going out in the garden and gardening, going out on walks. So you can color that in green. Again, any significant events, we've got things such as deaths and birthdays and things like that. What was difficult? So again, linking that to certain emotions, if the fact that you're worried about the coronavirus, you could put that in red again, color that in red. And thinking about planning in terms of how we learnt best. So could it be that we learnt best by going online, using those sort of symbols and having that on our sheet of paper? And again, thinking about planning going forward, about going back to school or madrasa, are we worried about the social interactions? Are we worried about learning? Or are we worried about the coronavirus? Again, that could be in red. Again, I said for non-verbal children, they could point to these symbols or and use a sort of limited amount of symbols there instead. Next slide, please, Sheikh. Okay, so a transition period. So again, thinking about returning back to school or madrasa in September, there needs to be an acceptance that any transition period will be very difficult. And it will be maybe even more difficult as to when the transition to lockdown began. So this 6 months is a long period of time that our children have developed in. So really communication is key. So talking to your child's teacher about what worked well over lockdown, what was difficult, what was challenging, and really start to instill this new routine that will be really embedded into their curriculum. So thinking about social distancing, reduced class sizes that might be happening, thinking about teachers moving instead. So thinking about secondary, that movement break that would have between different classes, would go to from going to English to maths or maths to science, for example. In this new COVID world, that movement break will no longer exist. So again, getting these ideas across to our children will be key to making sure that they're comfortable with what will happen. And as I mentioned, especially in the first few weeks, parents want to find out what's happening from their school and why it's happening. So, thinking about reduced class sizes, as I mentioned, the differences of movements, of social bubbles, as I said again. Next slide, please, Sheikh. So Sister Zainab in the previous webinar mentioned about social stories, and I want to go into a little bit more detail here. So social stories are a visual tool that really help students with SEN and autism to really visualize and understand what's happening and why. So the idea is that you have those symbols that are there and are clear, and very clear and unambiguous language is being used to explain what's happening. So we mentioned here that schools have been closed. I've stayed at home. I'm doing some good activities. I'm doing some learning. Sometime our school will open. The government will decide when. So the whole idea is that it's clear language, it's factual, it's to the point. And we mentioned here that it can be used in other situations. So if you're visiting families, for example, I'll be visiting my grandma or granddad on this weekend. In order to be safe, we'll sit outside. We won't hug or touch them. So these sorts of things is a way of really making things clear to our children and sort of chunking this information down into small bits. Next slide, please, Sheikh. So as we're reflecting on the lockdown experience, we'll see that different families would have experienced lockdown in many different ways. Some families would have experienced lockdown being in flats without garden access, whereas some would have experienced lockdown being in houses. And what we've noticed is that some children with needs would have been very, very understimulated. The fact that they've been cooped up inside, they're definitely in need of going out and experiencing things more. Thinking about the lockdown experience and the learning experience of some of our children at Fatima Elizabeth over Zoom. So one child stands out who had diagnosed of selective mutism. So he had selective mutism, which is essentially a social anxiety disorder, where they really, really find it difficult to interact with other students. They find it difficult to interact with other members of their classroom and their teachers. Essentially very, very, very quiet. And what we've noticed is that as soon as we've migrated over to the online platform, they've become much more talkative, being able to use the chat function online. So the lockdown experience in terms of a learning function has been very, very positive for them. Now, if we contrast that with a student who, in terms of the face-to-face learning experience that they were having pre-COVID, they were loving school, they were loving madrasa, yet the whole idea of putting them in front of a laptop was extremely terrifying for them, and it just wasn't working with them at all. So again, these learning experiences for our students will be highly individualized, and I think that really needs to be taken into account as well. I mentioned here that some students will have enjoyed the freedom of home learning. So having that freedom, that flexibility to really learn at their own pace without having to go with a teacher, without having to go to the demands of a classroom, will have been really, really liberating for them. And the idea of going back into a classroom will be really terrifying. And I've been speaking to a lot of parents recently, and what we've noted and discussed is that there will be much more school refusers. So certain students have said that they're not coming back to school in September, no matter what's going to happen, because they've just enjoyed being at home. They've enjoyed being able to learn at their own pace. So this could be problematic, especially if obviously parents have to go back to work come September when schools will fully reopen. Next slide, please, Sheikh. So thinking about communication and coming back into school in September, communication generally can be very taxing for anyone with ASD and SEN. And thinking about the fact that they've been at home for a good 4 or 5 months without the need to interact with other people, without the need to talk to other people as well, it can be very, very tiring. All of a sudden throwing them back into a classroom environment where they have to listen to people, where they have to attend to the teacher, where they have to respond to classroom conversations. And this sort of dichotomy of having to learn in a completely different way to what they've been doing over the last 4 or 5 months can really, really be very taxing on our students. And I think what we have to sort of take into account here is that our children will need time to process what's been said, especially in conversations and in terms of turn taking. And what could happen is that there could be more meltdowns, and I think we should really factor in the fact that there could be more meltdowns come September for some of these students with ASD. And what I think will be really key is that the fact that they've been learning for 7 hours, they've been cooped up in a classroom now for 7 hours straight, been in one classroom without having that movement breaks that they're used to. I think as soon as they come home, they might need some quiet time just to really reflect and process what's been said. And even sort of during the day at school, they might need some time to have some breaks where they are in a quieter environment, where they're in a calmer environment as well. I think that will be key in terms of making sure they're much more comfortable come return to school in September. Next slide, please, Sheikh. Okay, so again, sort of related to communication, thinking about sort of social interaction issues. So what we've noted with students with ASD or sort of social communication issues is that they really, really try to fit in with their peers, and they try to sort of mask their difficulties as much as possible. And this can be very taxing for our students with ASD and SEN. There could be anxiety about the fact that they're feeling that they are different to others as well. What could be useful here, potentially depending on how your child is feeling, is a potential phased return to school. And this could be something which will be discussed with your Senkos in the mainstream school as well. But potentially slowly reintegrating into school with a smaller group might be useful. As I've been talking to certain students over lockdown, there could be anxiety about sort of forgetting the social niceties as we do when we're talking to someone, you know, taking turns of conversation, listening to others in terms of what they might say, taking turns appropriately. So those anxieties might be heightened as well. And what I've mentioned here is that there could be anxieties related to COVID. So if you think about us going outside into a supermarket or going outside into a shop, for example, we might feel really, really anxious if someone coughs or sneezes around us. Now, for a student who has ASD or any SEN, those anxieties might be heightened. And I think it's really key that we have those conversations to say, okay, being able to cough is an absolutely normal response for some of our, for us normally. And I think if they know it's a normal incidence of coughing, it might sort of alleviate some of those anxieties going forward. Next slide, please, Chef. Okay, so we mentioned before that adapting to change is a big issue for SEN, for students with SEN. So what is key is having that conversation about what the change will entail and accepting that things will not be the same as they were pre-COVID. So as I mentioned before, things such as social distancing, reduced class sizes. And I think what will be key here is trying to mentally prepare our students with visuals. So take photos beforehand of what the classroom will look like prior to coming into back to school. Having that conversation with your teachers or your Ustadhs or your Ustadhas in terms of how the plan of the classroom may look like. Maybe using some videos of coming into the school gates, going up the school stairs. Might be helpful just to re-familiarize our students again. Again, similar sort of thing, just using photos and videos to just help build that familiarity, even with things with which they were doing before COVID, which they were used to. So it could be that route that we're going into school, taking pictures of the road that we're walking down, maybe the pictures of the buses that they were going on or the trains that were going on before COVID as well, just to help re-familiarize themselves in terms of what they were doing before coronavirus. As I said before, just try and chunk this information and make it smaller and more accessible for them to process. As we mentioned before, listen to how they found their own learning now in lockdown, use that going forward. So as I mentioned with Maulana Hamid, we've discussed perhaps using more online lessons for some of our students who really enjoyed the chat function and being able to interact in that way. So trying to sort of reintegrate some of those lessons going forward. And I mentioned, can there be those with special needs who can contribute to our society and our madrasa? So are there any special talents which our students have learned over lockdown that can be really introduced into madrasa going forward? Have they learned a new skill that they could really introduce? Have they learned about, vlogging, for example, which they could try and put that forward in terms of their classroom learning, or just generally for the madrasa? Perhaps they could sort of vlog about their daily walks or their daily bike rides, and use it as a tool to talk about certain things going forward, inshallah. Next slide, please, Chef. Using a visual timetable properly. So one of the things which we see a lot in certain schools is visual timetables are being put in place, but they're not being used properly. So the whole idea is that you're crossing off an activity as you're going through them. So after you're done with breakfast, after you're done with playtime, after you're done with snack time, you've crossed that off, or you've popped that off into a finish box, and you're done with that part of your day. The really good thing about visual timetables is that it can be used from nursery all the way up to college students, because it's a really, really good tool in terms of having a visual tool there that they can sort of process and use going forward. And the whole idea is you're developing independence of where they're going and what they're doing, making themselves familiarized, especially if they're coming from perhaps year 6 and going into a new setting in terms of secondary school. Just in terms of building up that familiarity, especially in the first few weeks of school, the first month of secondary school. If you think about ourselves as well, we tend to really use a form of a visual tool as well. If we think back to Ramadan, we would cross off the days of our calendar. So the first day of Ramadan is done, so we cross it off. Day 2 is done, day 3 is done. And it just helps us process what we've accomplished and where we are in terms of going forward, and thinking about moving forward towards the weekend or moving forward to the next holiday or next break. Next slide, please, Sheikh. Okay, so thinking about the emotions and what we're feeling, I think there's going to be a range of emotions that will be different across the spectrum. Certain people will feel really, really anxious about the virus. They'll feel happy that they're going back to school because they can meet their friends, they can meet their teachers again who they've really missed. As we mentioned before, there could be some school refusers, and they could be really upset about returning to school as well. Autistic children are really different in terms of how they process emotions and recognize emotions. They might see death in sort of a black and white thing, okay, it's happened now we're moving on. This person passed away, it hasn't really affected me that much. Or as on the flip side of it, it can really, really affect someone emotionally, and really affect them going forward as well. There could be a delay in understanding certain emotions. So what I see in schools a lot is if a student is being told off, for example, in one classroom, they've been told off by their teacher, or not if even they haven't been told off, but the class has been told off, and there's been shouting that's going on. The student has then gone on to their next class, can be a completely different class, completely different scenario, but then they've only really just processed what has happened. And then after a good hour or so, they've started to cry because they've just processed what had happened an hour ago. So again, these sorts of emotions and sorts of feelings could definitely happen. Again, not necessarily understanding what they're feeling, being hyper emotional and sensitive to emotions around them. If there's anger, if there's excitement, that could really, really affect some of our students as well. I've mentioned using more visuals, such as communication cartoons or strips. One of the things which I do a lot with some of my autistic learners is using communication cartoons. So it's like a visual tool where they're able to draw out what's happened, and it can really help them to process what has gone on. And again, using the sort of social stories in a similar sort of way that I mentioned before. And I mentioned using emojis here because emojis here are a good visual way in terms of getting students to describe how they're feeling. Emotional processing is sort of the idea of listening and recognizing the signs of certain feelings. So if we're seeing that some of our students are feeling more anxious, they could be stimming, they could be rocking, they could be flapping their hands a lot more, they could be picking at their skin and responding in a different way. So it's up to us as parents and teachers and therapists to really recognize those signs of anxiety or feeling certain things, and try to make them feel a lot more comfortable. Could that be giving them a sensory break? Could it giving a classroom break? Giving them a break by walking outside the classroom, having a walk around just to process what's happened. One of the things which I mentioned before is that there could be those feelings of grief, of perhaps the loss of a family member, the loss of lockdown life. Certain students were really loved being at home, and those anxieties of going back into school could really, really be present. As I mentioned before, sort of those feelings of anxiety related to COVID, which are still prevalent, as there's talk of a second wave being sort of emerging here as well. Next slide, please, Sheikh. So the conclusion: there's still a large uncertainty in terms of what will happen. Teachers and unions are protesting the idea of schools returning all at once, and there's this whole idea of a second wave being re-emerging here, and again we just don't know what could happen. So again, the whole idea of being open and honest with our students in terms of saying, okay, we don't know what will happen, but we do know that schools are scheduled to return, and just having that conversation on a daily basis with our children. Well, you can so discuss with your teachers, with your Senkos, in terms of how best to manage and how best to go forward. Thinking about online resources, there's Nathan.com, Special Needs Jungle, Ipsia, which have really, really good resources for planning for SEN. More resources could be found at reachoutaasc.com and studio.tv. And thank you to the unsung heroes. So I mentioned this in my previous webinar as well. The parents who have to manage and look after our students with SEN on a daily basis, not only during lockdown. These are the really the unsung heroes of the coronavirus pandemic, because they've managed and looked after these students and these children every single day from the moment that they're born. So yeah, Jazakallah khairan to all our listeners, and Jazakallah for listening to this presentation. I think we'll go on to the discussion bit, Sheikh.
Sure. Okay, Jazakallah for that presentation, Sheikh. That's been very, very enlightening and very, very helpful in terms of for those of us who have children with special needs. But I think even in general, children who who do not have any kind of formal special needs, even for them it will be difficult coming back to normality. And even us adults, there's so many questions. How do we go about things? How normal are things going to be? So Jazakallah for that presentation. I think it's very useful, and especially I think for our parents at Fatima Elizabeth, and also teachers as well. We will like to take note of all of these, and inshallah when we do get that back, and I think something that you mentioned, that there might be a child crying, and it could be something that he or she has experienced like an hour ago or 2 hours ago. So we need to be extra careful. We need to be extra conscientious. We need to really think about the needs of our children. We were supposed to be doing that before anyway, but I think now that becomes even more emphasized, especially for our teachers and also parents as well. So we may find when we do come back to madrasa, or when students do go back to school, especially the younger ones, they may begin to cry, and it's just that the whole thing about experiencing something new, that will be overwhelming for them. So they need that support. So inshallah, we have that in place. We have a better understanding of that. I certainly believe after this presentation. So what we'll do, inshallah, we won't take too long. There were some questions from previous lesson that we will just, or Ustadh Danyaal will address, but there's one come in from this session, and I think it's a good question. It's not to do with post-lockdown, but it is to do with lessons or sessions during lockdown. So Sister Layla is asking, Assalamu alaikum, I need advice how to help my son to behave in front of the camera. As soon as the camera is on and he can see his face on the screen, he starts making silly face expressions. Advise.
Sheikh, you're the expert when it comes to Zoom and StreamYard. Do you have any advice when it comes to this?
I think, even when teaching online, especially on Zoom, students are doing that. It's different. They are going to react differently. And I guess, there could be a number of ways of doing that. Maybe turning the camera off, but if their camera needs to be on, maybe speaking to them, beforehand to say, look, the person on the other side, they can see you making these, these facial expressions. So for some students, it just seems like a mirror, isn't it? That they're almost like looking at themselves, making silly faces. But I think trying to explain, sitting them down, explaining that the person on the other side, or not just one person, but a number of people on the other side could see you doing these, and how do you feel about them seeing you like that?
I wonder whether perhaps a social story or social cartoon might be useful in the scenario. So, if you make a silly face, then your teacher will be able to see you, your classmates will be able to see you. Therefore, I'll be very embarrassed. You don't want mummy or daddy to be very embarrassed. And again, having it in a very structured way, sort of storyboarding it so you can see clearly the consequences of them making silly faces.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so stories. So that's definitely one thing. Jazakallah for that, Sheikh. Sister Layla, I hope that answered your question. Do let us know if you have any ways, or if there's anything else that we can, or Ustadh Danyaal can help with, inshallah. So, Ustadh Danyaal, any questions from last week that you want to kind of go over?
So going back a couple of weeks ago, it was a comment that was left on our video with Ustadha Nabeela and Sister Zainab. I think Brother Atif Chowdhury mentioned, his comment was, each CEP issues schools not doing the paperwork, as well as local councils delaying everything. So the idea that if we're trying to get an EHCP for one of our pupils,
could you explain what that is?
So an EHCP is a educational health and care plan. essentially it's a legal document which outlines the provisions which schools or caregivers need to give in terms of one-to-one support or speech and language therapy or physiotherapy that student is legally entitled to. So that's what an EHCP is. So the brother was making the point that schools are not doing the paperwork, as well as local councils delaying everything. So they're trying their best perhaps to try to get a educational health and care plan for a particular student or their child. And what they're seeing is the schools aren't doing their bit in terms of getting things going forward, or they're being very, very slow with it. What I've noticed is that when it comes to sort of paperwork, bureaucracy can be very, very time consuming, especially for schools, especially for local councils. And there is a process anyway where the consultation period takes about 8 weeks. So if it's agreed that a student of SEN will have an education, health and care plan, there's a consultation period of about 8 weeks where all the professionals involved will be consulted, and they can get their assessments in on time, and they can really assess what's going on with that student, and they can put forward their recommendations. If it's delayed longer than that 8 weeks, then it's not right. It's going against the statutory requirements of the educational health and care plan. But again, it's up to local council to enforce it. So it's a shame that they're delaying things as well. I hope that answers or discusses that point a little bit more forward. But again, the 8-week period is statutory for professionals to get things forward and clear. Was that clear, Sheikh?
Yep, that was. Jazakallah for that, Sheikh.
The brother also made another point. Post-16, there's not much available for children with autism. Now, I think this is an issue not just with schools, but just even at a sort of societal level as well, that after 16 years old, after secondary school, there really much is a case of them being let off into college. So they have that period where they're sort of between 16 to 18, they're still sort of considered young adults, still considered children. But definitely after 18, there seems to be this big vacuum, not just in schools and colleges, but just generally at a sort of societal level in terms of getting them ready for sort of life post education, if you like. What we have noticed is that students with educational health and care plans, it does entitle them to, if they're not going into higher education, to be given some form of education up until they're 25. So the health and care plan will be reviewed post 16, and there will be some form of provision that will be put into place for these students. But I think the brother's absolutely right. There isn't much going forward for students post 16. And it's something that does need to be looked at a sort of greater societal level as well. I don't know if you want to add to that, Sheikh.
No, Jazakallah for that, Sheikh. Do you have any more questions? Otherwise, we'll take one more from this session.
That was it, Sheikh, in terms of the previous session.
Sure. So we've got Sister Layla again, so I'll read out her question. Thank you for the answer. I talked about how people react on silly faces, etc., but my son says he doesn't care what other people think of him, and he really doesn't care. Advise.
What would you say to that, Sheikh?
I think it is a difficult one, of course. If we're looking at it from a principal Islamic perspective, at this stage, it's all about وَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَى تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. That it's about just constantly reminding, maybe not pushing, but just reminding that look, people can think like this, and then not only that, just constant reminder. Maybe at some point they will understand. So we do it with that intention, with that love and care, and I definitely believe all mothers do that. And it's just about for parents to just try and be as patient as possible, because there may be so many things going on in the mind and life of a child that we may be unaware of, or we may be aware of, but like this situation where we don't know how to deal with it. I mean, I would find that situation very difficult as well. But I think it is constantly about reminding, reminding with that love and with the intention that inshallah, hopefully at some point he or she will get it. That's all I can say on that point, I think.
Yeah, I think just sort of thinking about that, again, asking why he's making the silly face.
Yeah.
What are the reasons? Like, does he think other people will laugh? Is it making himself laugh? Or what are the reasons behind it? Because if it's trying to make other people laugh, then it's not really funny. But then again, just trying to make them realize that, okay, you know, if he doesn't care what other people think of him, well, you know, people are not going to laugh at the fact that he's making a silly face in that scenario. But perhaps, you know, the visual tools, as I mentioned, might really help him. Well, one thing which could be beneficial here is actually video him making those silly faces and just give him that extra sort of visual representation of how he actually looks to the outside world. That might be helpful.
He may find it funny, Sheikh.
Wow.
So yeah, so it is a tough one. It's definitely a tough one. But also, I think it also depends on any particular specific special needs a child may have, and maybe dealing it down that route.
I wonder if he's interacting with another person, whether they could actually say, okay, look, we have to move on now. It's not funny. So he's getting that extra feedback from a different person, like a different voice, other than his mother or father. That might be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we hope we've done somewhat of justice to answering that question. Yeah, so I really hope that inshallah we've all benefited from Ustadh Danyaal's words of wisdom, from his experience. I definitely have, and it's just about, I think there was so much in that presentation. It's just a matter of breaking it down bit by bit, maybe rereading it for yourselves and breaking it down if it's possible. Ustadh, Sister Layla is saying, yes, he finds silly faces very funny and thinks others will laugh too. So so maybe just explaining that others don't find it funny, and maybe getting others to say that to him. Yeah, cool. So Jazakallah for that, Ustadh Danyaal. If any of our parents or any of our teachers have any further questions, we will take them, inshallah, over the coming weeks. You can ask them myself or Ustadh Danyaal or to admin, and they'll make sure that the question reaches us. So inshallah, we will stay in touch. And if we do have any special needs sessions, we will inshallah send them out. They'll always be available on our YouTube channel, so you can go there, find them. They'll be also available directly on our Facebook page as well. So this is always streamed live on Facebook, on YouTube, and also my channel as well. Ustadha Yasmin is saying, SEN children are amazing. Thank you for the presentation and insight. I cannot agree more with that. Jazakallah khairan for that. Absolutely. And sometimes we think special needs is something inferior. Actually, these children have so much that they can give, just like Einstein had special needs. But when he was able to fully grasp and understand himself and how to learn and how to move forward, he changed the world for what we know today. So there are many people like that out there. So absolutely, 100% agree. Jazakallah khairan, Shaykh. I think we'll bring this to an end. Jazakallah, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.